When Charlie Sheen sold his longtime Beverly Hills mansion in 2023, he was eager to leave behind not just a chapter of his life, but also the eerie disturbances that had plagued the property for years. At the time, he laughed off any mention of ghosts, attributing the strange occurrences to bad energy or Hollywood craziness. Yet those closest to him knew he had become increasingly unsettled in the final years of his residence there. The house, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa, had been the site of numerous wild parties, scandals, and personal struggles, but according to Sheen, something darker lurked beneath it all. He spoke of hearing whispers at night, of seeing shadowy figures moving through the halls. More than once, he had woken up to find furniture inexplicably rearranged. The most unnerving experience, however, had been the repeated sightings of a woman in white, standing at the foot of his bed, her face obscured by tangled hair. In late 2023, the house was purchased by David and Lauren Kessler, a wealthy couple from New York looking for a fresh start in Los Angeles. David, a venture capitalist, and Lauren, a former model turned interior designer, were drawn to the home's luxurious design and prime location. They had heard the rumors but dismissed them as Hollywood gossip. First, everything seemed fine. The couple settled in with their 2 young children, renovating the home to match Lauren's modern aesthetic. But within weeks, things began to unravel. Their 6-year-old son, Oliver, refused to sleep in his room, claiming a lady with broken hands kept staring at him from the closet. Doors slammed shut on their own. A cold, sickly sweet scent like decaying flowers hung in the air at night. Then there was the basement. One evening, David went down to inspect a faulty breaker when he heard the distinct sound of laughter, a deep, guttural chuckle coming from the darkness. When he turned around, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw something standing at the far end of the room. A man, or what used to be one. His mouth stretched too wide, his eyes sunken and black. David ran upstairs, breathless. He didn't tell Lauren at first, but the next morning, she mentioned hearing someone whispering in her ear while she slept. The couple began digging into the history of the mansion. Before Charlie Sheen's wild years, the house had belonged to a silent film actress named Evelyn Rourke, who mysteriously vanished in the 1930s. Some claimed she had been murdered by a jealous lover. Others believed she had taken her own life after a failed comeback attempt. Her body was never found, but according to urban legend, she was last seen in that very house. Charlie Sheen himself had once joked about the property being cursed, mentioning in a 2011 interview that weird things happened there, but whether he truly believed it or not, he never spoke of it again. For the Kesslers, the breaking point came on a cold February night. Lauren awoke to the feeling of something pressing down on her chest. She opened her eyes to find a figure looming over her pail, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. She screamed, waking David, but by the time he turned on the lights, the figure was gone. The next day, the family packed their bags and moved into a hotel. The house was listed again within the month, this time at a significant loss. No explanation was given. Today, the mansion remains unsold. Realtors struggle to keep buyers interested. Some say it's the economy. Others whisper that whatever haunted Charlie Sheen is still there, waiting for its next victim. The Kesslers never returned to the house. Their belongings, expensive furniture, imported artwork, everything remained untouched, locked inside like artifacts in a forgotten museum. The realtors, eager to erase the growing rumors, scrubbed the online listings, removed any trace of the property's connection to Sheen or its disturbing history. Yet, despite their efforts, the house sat vacant, its grand iron gates rusting ever so slightly under the relentless California sun. For months, it loomed silently over the cul-de-sac, a shell of its former self. At night, neighbors reported strange sounds emanating from within. The distant echo of a woman weeping, the distinct clatter of heavy footsteps pacing along the marble floors. The house, it seemed, had not accepted its abandonment. And then, in the fall of 2024, someone new moved in. Dr. Alan Whitmore was not a man who scared easily. A respected psychiatrist with a background in neurological research, he had spent decades studying the human mind, dissecting the complexities of fear and delusion. When he heard about the Beverly Hills mansion listed at nearly half its market value, he saw an opportunity. A grand estate in an affluent neighborhood, discarded due to superstitions? He had no patience for ghost stories. With his wife, Elise, and their teenage daughter, Madeline, Alan moved in without hesitation. The house was everything they had ever dreamed of: vaulted ceilings, a sweeping staircase, a pool that shimmered under the moonlight. The previous owners had left behind elegant chandeliers and Persian rugs, their departure so sudden that even a crystal decanter of whiskey still sat untouched on the marble bar. Elise took it upon herself to breathe life back into the space, filling it with warm lights, fresh flowers, and the scent of lavender candles. She played soft jazz in the evenings, her fingers gliding along the keys of the abandoned grand piano in the foyer. Even Madeline, typically withdrawn and unimpressed by her parents' constant relocations, found herself drawn to the house's eerie charm. But the house was not impressed with them. It started subtly, as it always did. Doors left ajar when no one had touched them. The flicker of the dining room chandelier, its crystals chiming softly as though disturbed by a passing breeze. The grandfather clock in the hallway, its pendulum still despite the steady ticking sound that filled the silence of the night. Then came the voices. Alan was the first to hear them, low murmurs threading through the walls late into the evening. He dismissed them at first, attributing the sounds to settling wood, the natural groans of an aging house. But one night, as he sat in his study reviewing patient files, he heard his own name spoken in a whisper. Not from the hall, not from outside, from the empty chair across from him. He turned slowly, his pulse quickening despite himself. The leather armchair, its deep brown cushions dented from years of use, sat untouched in the dim glow of his desk lamp. Yet the air around it felt heavy, charged, as though something unseen had only just departed. Alan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Lack of sleep, he reasoned. Stress. He refused to mention it to Elise. But the house did not care for silence. Madeline had never been a believer in ghosts. At 16, she was more interested in photography and late-night phone calls with friends than the supernatural. But the house intrigued her in ways she couldn't explain. It was too still, too aware, as if it had been watching, waiting, for someone to notice. One afternoon, while exploring the basement, she found a door she hadn't noticed before. Nestled in the farthest corner behind stacked boxes and old furniture, it was different from the others, smaller, almost hidden, with a tarnished brass handle that left her palms smelling of metal when she touched it. It was locked. Curious, she pressed her ear against the wood. First, there was nothing, just the faint hum of the house's central air. And then a whisper, soft, drawn out. Her name, Maddie. She staggered backward, heart hammering against her ribs. The whisper had been faint, barely more than a breath. But it had been real. She fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She did not return to that part of the house. Not yet. The shadow in the mirror. Elise was alone in their bedroom when it happened. It was late past midnight, the house steeped in a hush so deep it felt unnatural. She was brushing her hair in front of the vanity, the rhythmic strokes of her brush the only sound in the vast, high-ceilinged room. Then, from the mirror, something moved. A shadow, not her own. It flickered just behind her. A dark figure that shifted in the dim light, its edges bleeding into the air like smoke. Her breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around the brush. Slowly, she turned. Nothing. The room behind her was empty. She let out a shaky laugh, forcing herself to relax. The mind plays tricks in the dark, Alan would say. Yet when she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was still there. Closer. Elise let out a strangled cry, stumbling away from the vanity. The mirror stood before her, reflecting only the room, the ornate headboard of their bed, the flickering candle on the nightstand. But she had seen it, felt it. The next morning, she told Alan. He dismissed it, of course. Stress, he said. The move, the new environment. Elise nodded, but deep down she knew. This was no trick of the mind. The house was waking up, and it had noticed them. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days passed in uneasy quiet. The house, once filled with Elisa's warm lights and the scent of lavender candles, grew colder. It wasn't just the temperature, though, that, too, seemed to plummet without explanation. It was a presence, an invisible weight pressing down on the rooms, thickening the air with something unseen but unmistakable. The grand chandelier in the foyer no longer chimed gently in the evenings it swayed. Not always, but often enough that Elise had begun watching it from the second-floor landing, waiting for the moment it would start its slow, rhythmic movement, as though something unseen had brushed past. Alan, of course, remained unmoved. His rational mind refused to acknowledge the things Elise tried to tell him. The way the mirrors seemed to hold onto reflections a second too long, how the grandfather clock ticked even when its pendulum remained still, how the air felt charged with something unspeakable. He dismissed it all, wrapped in his certainty, insulated by the belief that the mind could play cruel tricks. But even Alan could not ignore the basement door. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the sound woke him. A slow, deliberate creaking, the unmistakable groan of wood shifting against its frame. Alan stirred, at first believing it to be the wind, though he knew well that no draft could move doors in a house as solidly built as this one. Then came the tap, 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 a slow, rhythmic knocking against the floorboards. He sat up. Elise stirred beside him, murmuring in her sleep but not waking. The house was silent now, save for the faint whistle of air through the vents. Alan exhaled and swung his legs over the edge of the bed, standing barefoot on the cold wooden floor. He moved carefully, listening, following some unspoken pull that guided him down the hallway, past Madeline's closed door, down the grand staircase. The darkness of the foyer swallowed him as he descended, the chandelier above casting long, skeletal shadows along the walls. And then he saw it. The basement door stood ajar. Not much, barely more than an inch, but enough to know it had been opened. Enough to see the darkness beyond, deep and unbroken. Alan frowned. He distinctly remembered locking it earlier that evening. Madeline had mentioned the door to him in passing, something about hearing noises behind it, but he had dismissed her concerns. Now, staring at the narrow opening, he felt something stir deep in his chest. Not fear, no, he would not give in to such irrationality, but something close. A warning. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the door's edge, preparing to push it shut. Then, from the darkness below, came the whisper. Soft, ragged. Alan. He froze. The voice was distant, yet close, as if it had spoken not from the bottom of the stairs, but from the darkness just beyond the threshold. For the first time since moving into the house, Alan felt something ice-cold crawl along the base of his spine. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and did not go back to bed. Madeline woke up screaming. Her voice ripped through the walls, shattering the brittle silence of the early morning. Elise was the first to reach her room, Alan close behind. Their daughter was sitting upright in bed, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at something beyond them. Her skin was slick with sweat, her hair clinging to her face. Elise rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her, whispering soft reassurances, but Madeline did not move, did not blink. It took nearly a minute before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She was in my room. Elise pulled back slightly. Who? Sweetheart. The woman. Alan stiffened. What woman? Madeline turned to look at him then, and for the first time in his life, he saw true terror in his daughter's face. She was sitting at the end of my bed, Madeline whispered. Watching me. Elise let out a quiet breath. It was just a dream, Maddie. Night terrors, they feel real sometime. Madeline shook her head violently. She was there. Alan wanted to push back, to argue, but something in the way Madeline's fingers dug into her blanket made him stop. Her hands were trembling. What did she look like? Elise asked gently. Madeline hesitated. Then, in a voice so small it barely carried across the room, she said, I couldn't see her face. A silence stretched between them. Madeline swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. Her hair was covering it. Like she didn't want me to see. Or like I wasn't supposed to. Elise tightened her grip around her daughter. Alan said nothing. The days blurred after that. Elise grew restless, unable to shake the feeling of something watching her from the dark corners of the house. The kitchen lights flickered no matter how many times the wiring was checked. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed along the upstairs hallway when no one was there. And at night the knocking returned. Always from the basement. Tap, tap, tap. Alan refused to acknowledge it. Elise avoided the lower floors altogether. Madeline stopped sleeping in her room. But the house was patient. And it was waiting. The house had won. It did not need to lash out in violence. Nor did it need to scream through the walls or throw objects across rooms. It did what it had always done: watched, whispered, waited. It let its presence settle over the Whitmores like a damp fog, creeping into their bones, filling their lungs, making the air heavy and stale. It let them hear it in the walls, feel it in the cold spots that moved when they weren't looking, taste it in the metallic tang that sometimes clung to their tongues after an evening spent too long in the house's suffocating silence. The house was alive and it was hungry. Alan was the last to break. Elise had stopped playing the piano. The warm jazz notes that once filled the halls had vanished, leaving only the house's breathy sighs in the empty spaces. She spent most of her time outside now, finding excuses to run errands, visit friends, linger in coffee shops where the air was not so thick. Madeline refused to be alone. Her phone, once her greatest distraction, was now a useless comfort. No Wi-Fi, no service, no calls going through. The house had severed their connection to the outside world in ways neither Alan nor Elise could explain. And Alan had fought it the longest. Even now, as he sat in his study, staring at the locked basement door through the dim yellow glow of his desk lamp, he told himself there was nothing to fear, that it was all in their minds, that this house, this cursed, rotting carcass of Hollywood excess and tragedy, was nothing more than wood and stone. But the door was open again, just an inch, and this time he heard more than a whisper, a creak of a floorboard from somewhere beyond, a slow, hesitant step, then another. Something was coming up the stairs. Alan swallowed, gripping the edge of his desk as his rational mind screamed at him to shut the door, to lock it, to turn away. But he could not, because he saw her, the woman. She stood halfway up the basement stairs, just beyond the sliver of darkness where the dim light from the study faded into shadow. Her form was still, too still, as if she were waiting for something. Her hair was long, tangled, covering her face entirely, hanging in thick, damp strands. But it was her hands that made Alan's stomach drop. They were bent at unnatural angles, fingers twisted and broken, the skin darkened with bruises or something worse. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. But not her own. It was as if multiple voices were inhaling at once, overlapping in a chorus of something deeply, impossibly wrong. Then she moved. Not a step, not a lurch, a shift. One moment, she was halfway up the stairs. The next, she was closer. Alan gasped, stumbling backward. The chair behind him scraped against the hardwood, but he didn't care. His heart was hammering, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Then, Alan, the voice came from everywhere. Not a whisper this time, but something deeper, fuller, curling around his name like fingers around a throat. The lights flickered. A cold breath swept over his skin. The basement door slammed shut on its own. And Alan finally believed. He didn't argue when Elise told him they were leaving. He didn't tell her she was imagining things when she woke up to long scratches running down the bedroom mirror, spelling out "get out" in letters too precise to be random damage. He didn't tell Madeline to calm down when she refused to sleep at all, when she began sitting by the window at night, staring out at the road, waiting for morning like a prisoner waits for freedom. They packed in a single night, clothes stuffed into suitcases without folding, boxes left half-filled. By dawn, the car was loaded, but as Alan locked the front door for the last time, he swore he heard it again. The tapping. Slow, patient, coming from inside. The Whitmores left Beverly Hills without looking back. The house was relisted within weeks, though the asking price had dropped again. Realtors changed the listing name, called it a modern restoration opportunity, erased all mention of its past. But the house remembered. It always did. And when the next owners arrived, smiling, optimistic, ready to begin their new lives, the house welcomed them. It was patient. It would wait. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.